I'd like to thank Marie and Dan for organizing this event, and Anthony for chairing the panel. And also thank you to Ahmed for this very interesting talk. So despite the fact that we're meeting to celebrate the 350th birthday of the TTP, that text has been quite peripheral to my work. I have mainly focused on the ethics and the TP. My focus was to try and understand what freedom and emancipation would mean for individuals such as states and social movements. And so I take a mesological perspective on that problematic, like quite a few commentators of Spinoza. And by mesology, I mean a perspective that takes into account the role played by the milieu in the process of individuation, reproduction, and emancipation. So in that regard, for example, Justin Steinberg argues in his latest book that, I quote, Spinoza was very much alive to the fact that human freedom and self-control depend critically on external causes. If we want to live joyful and intellectually rich lives, our environment must be structured in ways that conduce to this aim. And likewise, Laurent Boff argued about 2 decades before in La Stratégie du Conatus that for Spinoza, I quote, the political problem for bodies and for ideas, or minds, is that of a space to produce, liberate and defend. Le problème politique, tant pour les corps que pour les idées, est un problème d'espace à produire, à libérer et à défendre. So for my work, I look at this phenomenon not from the perspective of human individuals, but from that of individuals such as states and social movements, and a conceptual move which I argue Spinoza's framework allows. So these commentators make use of the notion of environment or milieu, but in Spinoza's work, and more generally during the time of Spinoza, there is no recourse to the notion of environment and milieu, and thinkers still speak of external causes or circumstances up until the 19th century. So I endeavored a while ago to understand the birth of these notions, those of environment and milieu, and to do that I studied what could be called their prehistory. So there is one book in that regard, which I came across quite randomly and which proved absolutely amazing to reconstruct the prehistory of these notions. That book is Clarence Glacken's Traces on the Rhodian Shores, subtitled Nature and Culture in Western Thought from Ancient Times to the End of the 18th Century, and published in 1967. So in French, it was published under the name A History of Geographical Thought, Histoire de la pensée géographique, and published in 4 volumes. So reading this book and a few other sources led me to better understand a tradition which dates back at least to the times of the pre-Socratic, a tradition which strives to understand the influence of the climate. The climate, understood in a classical sense, includes the climate as we understand it today, but also astrology, or the influence of the stars on the climate, as well as the kind of diets which certain climate offers, etc. So a much broader understanding of the term climate. So this tradition is often misinterpreted, notably in France, as emerging during the Enlightenment era, during which there was a famous debate between Montesquieu and Voltaire regarding, according to their own formulation, the role of nature versus the role of culture in determining the people's ingenuity. And for the English-speaking world, David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity also seems to uncritically date this debate back to the Enlightenment era. So to give you an example, Montesquieu claimed that the empire of the climate is the first amongst all the empires. L'empire du climat est le premier de tous les empires. To which Voltaire answered that if the climate has any power, the government has 100 times more, and religion together with the government has even more. Si le climat a quelque puissance, le gouvernement 100 fois plus, et la religion jointe au gouvernement encore davantage. So unearthing the undiscontinued presence of this tradition from Hippocrates and Herodotus to the Enlightenment era has led me in turn to make the hypothesis I will present to you today regarding a new contextualization of the quote from the TTP that, I quote, only laws and customs can lead a nation to have its particular ingenuity. And that's in TTP chapter 17. So first, if we were to look at the context of this quote, it would seem that Spinoza specifies that only laws and customs are important in the constitution of a common ingenium, in opposition to language, which is listed with laws and customs in the sentence before, as factors distinguishing individuals as part of certain nations. It is certain that modern linguists could make the case that language, directly or indirectly, does play some kind of a role in the constitution of a common ingenium, and this was already argued by Rousseau. But I did not come across any text during and preceding Spinoza's era that argued that this was the case. So perhaps someone present today could enlighten me in that regard if I were to be wrong. Thus, although the climate is not mentioned, I think Spinoza is in fact referring to it with the odd insistence he shows when he claims that, I quote again, only laws and customs can lead a nation to have its particular ingenuity. And I hold that it is possible to claim, therefore, that Spinoza is in fact intervening against the Hippocratic tradition and holds that the climate, understood in its classical sense, plays no role in the constitution of a common ingenuum. So there are a few elements that I take to support this reading. First, Spinoza writes this sentence in the context of making some kind of a distinction between nature and culture. Although unusual, it is true in virtue of Spinoza's professed naturalism. He writes prior to that passage in the same paragraph that, I quote, nature creates individuals, not nations, individuals who are distinguished into nations only by the difference of language, laws, and accepted customs. We can get back to that in the discussion if time allows. This is a passage that has been commented quite a lot, notably by Matthieu in his endeavor to argue that states as conceptualized by Spinoza may be understood as individuals in accord with Spinoza's account of individuality. Second, there is the literature on the role of the climate in shaping people's common ingenuum, and it's very widespread during the time of Spinoza. So the discovery and approximate mapping of inhabited territories ensuing from the encounter with the New World greatly stimulated recourses to this ancient idea, the idea that factors such as astrology or the climate are the main determinants to a people's ingenuum. Yet, although unsystematical, reference to culture as a factor responsible for the shaping of a people's ingenuum also become increasingly common and mixed with those. So in this period, the author who most exhaustively treated and synthesized the question of the determinants to a people's ingenuum is certainly Baudin. He considers the role of the climate as a determinant, as well as the role of astrology in conditioning the climate, and therefore in indirectly conditioning people's ingenuum. He considers as conditioning those local particularities such as rivers and mountains. And finally, he also considers the influence of culture for, I quote, the mix and exchanges between people are not without changing greatly the nature of man and of his habits. Les mélanges des peuples ne sont pas non plus sans changer grandement la nature de l'homme et ses habitudes. Witness the Germans, who according to Baudin used to live like beasts, and who are now considered by the French jurists to have made such progress that, I quote, they seem to surpass the Asians for civilizations, the Romans for their military science, the Jews for religion, the Greeks for philosophy, the Egyptians for geometry, the Phoenicians for arithmetics, the Chaldeans for astrology, and all the other people for industrial development. And I spare you the French quote. Thus, according to Baudin, even a people like the German, whose climate would have apparently condemned to an unrefined life, such a people may, as a result of cultural exchanges, rise from his beastly condition so as to come second to none in comparison with those other people which had been gifted, or cursed perhaps, with a more favorable climate. So given the exceptional popularity of Baudin's work across Europe during the course of the 16th and 17th century, and the more general widespread awareness of this problematic, it is likely, I take, that Spinoza was aware of this problematic. Third, there is what Spinoza's library contained. So Spinoza's library contained a copy of Hippocrates' aphorism in 2 volumes. It also contains Riolani's Anatomica, of whom Colerus notes that he had inherited his passion for Hippocrates from his father. It also contains what could be a Hippocratic treatise written by a certain Nicosius, although this reference might also point toward a certain Nisolius, who wrote an absolutely unrelated Thesaurus Ciceronianus. It also contains numerous treatises dealing with astronomy, such as Longomoton's Astronomia Danica, De Sacro Bosco de Sfera, and Métis Alemariani Astronomicarum, to name a few. Although astronomy and astrology were indeed, by the 17th century, considered as very distinct disciplines, and in that regard we have Colbert, for example, a minister of Louis XIV in France, who excluded astrology from the Academy of Science, he creates in 1666, and who promulgates a bunch of other decrees against astrology and practitioners. Despite that, I have found that Métis Alemariani Astronomicarum, published in 1598, and De Sacro Bosco de Sfera, published in 1490, 2 of the works of astronomy mentioned as contained in Spinoza's library, to also be mentioned in a work called A Catalogue Raisonné of Occult Sciences, subtitled Astrological Books with a Sketch of the History of Astrology, written in 1911 by a certain Westcott. So I'm not a great Latinist at all, so I will leave those components in this matter to see whether or not this work actually contained anything astrological, or whether or not they solely stick to astronomy. So these are the few elements that lead me to hold as somewhat credible the hypothesis that Spinoza is in fact intervening against the Hippocratic tradition when he writes in his TTP that, I quote again, only laws and customs can lead a nation to have its particular ingenuity. So we have 3 minutes left, or a bit more. I'll be fast. So we can also ask ourselves whether Spinoza is correct or not, beyond simply deciphering the context of this quote. So first, we can ask, of course, whether or not there is such a thing as a common ingenium, or whether or not this idea is simply backward. It is indeed something which we can rightly be circumspect about, and I will let sociologists give their appreciation of that. I think maybe Anthony would like to comment on that too, since he works on commonality. Secondly, if we were to take seriously the idea that there are such things as common ingeniums, such as stated in the TTP, that the Hebrews are stiff-necked, that the Greeks are talkative, or that the Romans are violent, I want to ask, could we imagine factors influencing such common ingeniums, ingenia, beyond those which Spinoza holds as maturing, that is, laws and customs? So let us turn to the example of the Roman. If they are indeed violent, can this be solely attributed to their culture? So what about the temperature, part of the climate? Some of you might know the song by the Third World called 96 Degrees in the Shade, which was remixed when I was a teenager by Patrice and the Science Super Crew. So this song is a reference to the fact that at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, the human body gets stressed, which can lead it to snap and get violent. So perhaps during the time of the Roman Empire, it was simply too often the case that it was hot like that, but not so hot such as to lead the Romans to fall dizzy and sleep. And what about the diet? Biology tells us today that trans fatty acid consumption leads to stress, which may lead to upsurge in violence, and these are contained, for example, in overcooked olive oil, eggs, and chicken meat. Were these not part of the Roman diet? Of course they were. And you could make the case regarding diet that it is in fact a cultural and not a climatic thing, but in the classical sense of the term, the diet is a derivative of the climate. Finally, I will end with a small autocritique vis-à-vis the catchy title I used for this short intervention. So Hippocrates' treaty, where the role of the climate is most considered, had apparently remained undiscussed until the 16th century. As argued by Pearl in a paper published in 1975, it would seem that that treaty, which is called Of Airs, Waters, and Places, was not referenced in any commentary up until the 16th century. But of course, the rest of Hippocrates' work was commented. So despite this, the role of the climate was discussed extensively and by a large array of different commentators over the period that separates Hippocrates from Spinoza, whether these sources be Arabo-Muslim, Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Battuta, for example, or European, for example, Aristotle, Isidore of Sevilla, St. Thomas, Alberti, Boileau, and many more. So I like the following two verses from Boileau on the topic, so I will end on this. Des siècles, des pays, étudier les mœurs, les climats font souvent les diverses humeurs. Thank you all.